Hello, hello, hello. I'm here with Michael Huemer, Professor Michael Huemer from Philosophy Professor. Did you want to introduce yourself, Professor Huemer?
Sure. So I'm a professor at the University of Colorado at Boulder, where I've been for decades. I've written articles in epistemology, ethics, metaethics, political philosophy, and I have about a dozen amazing, brilliant books that you should immediately buy on Amazon. I also have a blog called Fake News on Substack, Fakenous, which everybody should read.
Okay, great. Professor, we're here to talk about intuitionism or phenomenal conservatism. So, like, my summary of intuitionism is that I guess you're kind of just saying, like, you're epistemically modest is my understanding. You seem to not be saying that you know a lot or that you know nothing or that you know absolutely. It's just that it's reasonable to assume that your appearances are true, right?
Yeah.
And so, of course, you're kind of, I mean, definitionally, you're saying if it seems to us that P, then the absence of defeaters, you have some degree of justification for believing in P. I guess you're saying that intuitions they're a sort of experience or mental state which is different from beliefs. And so yeah, is that correct?
That's right, yeah. So, like the question of epistemology, some people take the question of epistemology to be like, how can we be absolutely certain, or, like Descartes? And let's first start with the things that we could be absolutely 100% certain of, and then let's deduce consequences from it, like a mathematical system. But it doesn't work out because there aren't that many things, and so you can't deduce very many. There aren't that many absolutely certain starting points, so you can't deduce very much from it. But a better question is, well, what is it reasonable for us to believe? And I take that to be the question of epistemology. And so for that, you need a starting point before you start engaging in further reasoning. And the starting point is, well, let's just suppose everything is the way that it seems and see how far we could take that. Maybe the world is pretty much the way it seems, until we get reason for thinking otherwise.
Yeah, and I think you had like a line saying that like a bunch of people can have the same seemings or appearances, but you can still be false, right? Like it could still be that we think it seems to us all that, I don't know, some moral truth is right, but it could be in fact be that the appearances themselves is false. And so you have this like sort of like the seemings can be true or false, and so we're left in this spot of like it's all we got really, and I don't know how to explain it. I guess it's just sometimes it can correspond to the truth, sometimes they can't, and you kind of just have to do your best pretty much, accept the strongest impression or appearances and absent defeaters, I guess, right?
Yeah. So an important point is that seemings are non-factive, seemings or appearances. So it seems to me that P doesn't entail P. Now, this is in contrast to some other epistemological views. So some people try to found our belief system on acquaintance, which is a relation that you're supposed to have that you can only have to something real. Like these people would say, well, you're acquainted with your own present conscious mental states. And then maybe you're acquainted with some abstract objects, because that's how you're going to get the a priori knowledge.
Yeah, right.
And acquaintance entails the existence of the object that you're acquainted with. So if you're acquainted with a fact, that fact has to exist, has to be true. And I want to say, no, actually, the foundation is things appearing to be a certain way. So you could have foundational justification for believing something, and it could not be the case, right? So, there are examples like, okay, so like if you have a hallucination that seems exactly like a normal perception, then if you don't have any reason to think that you're hallucinating, you didn't get any clues with just like a normal perception, then you would be reasonable to just take it at face value. If you thought, if you thought you were hallucinating, you'd be crazy, even if you actually are, right? Yeah.
Sure. So like what's the intellectual history of arriving at phenomenal conservatism? Is it just, I don't know, your research into, I don't know what the words would be, epistemology or something? Or like, how did you arrive at PC, phenomenal conservatism?
I guess it's sort of from reflecting on it's just a fundamental orientation that I start by assuming things are the way they seem to be, unless I have reason for thinking otherwise, because I'm rational. And then what happened was that I reflected on that. I was thinking about philosophical skepticism from early in my period of, learning about philosophy. Like I was introduced to skepticism way back at the beginning, college, or even the end of high school. And so I was thinking about that, And then at first I was sort of like incorrectly led into spending time thinking about how you could be certain of things. Then I realized that the real question was, just like what should we believe, right?
Right.
We're not going to be 100% certain of things about the external world, but we should believe that there are physical objects on this. Okay. And it's a non-trivial question why we should believe that. Anyway, I think that there are other people, like there are some people, and especially philosophers, who have an attraction to things that are surprising and amazing, but don't seem to be true. Like it's almost like you're attracted to an idea precisely because it doesn't appear to be the case. Because wouldn't that be amazing? And we're like, oh, everybody's wrong about X, and like, isn't that exciting? And and so you get this kind of like positive emotional reaction to it, and then you feel like saying that or trying to defend that.
Yeah.
Anyway,
yeah. Well, like the philosopher Iris Murdoch said in Sovereignty of the Good or of Good, she had this quote where like philosophy has this two-way component to it of like creating complicated, intricate theories and like coming back to common sense. And I guess she says like McTaggart says time is unreal, and Moore says, well, I just had breakfast. Do you imagine your philosophical project is just about bringing common sense back into philosophy? I mean, yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, that is part of what I'm doing. Yeah. My reaction to skepticism is, yeah, we need to get back to common sense. And a lot of theories besides just skepticism and epistemology, like there are a lot of theories that are radically revisionary that a surprising number of people are sympathetic to, like the denial of free will, right? Where I think like free will is just a common sense belief. That is something that you presuppose all the time in ordinary life. Any normal person acts as if they have free will. But then there's a huge number of people in our intellectual culture who are like rejecting it. Or, like there are some people who are like denying the reality of the mind, denying the reality of consciousness. A small number of people actually outright say that, we don't have beliefs or something. But a larger number of people don't outright say that we don't have mental states, but they say that, we only have brain states, and, consciousness is just some kind of brain state. And I think that's very anti-common sense. And then there's a bunch of people who think like there's no real difference between right and wrong or good and bad. There's just like things that you prefer, things that you disprefer.
Right.
Like whatever. Okay. So like there's all of these radical views. And I think that no, like this has gone way too far away from, the normal intuitive things that seem to be the case.
Right. And like, why is that though? Like, is it like a philosophy thing where philosophers do philosophers lack common sense, or what's going on? Or is it, what I mean? Like, what's going on?
Yeah. Well, like, everybody has appearances. So I don't know, actually. I don't know if the philosophers just have different appearances from other people. Like these things don't seem crazy to them. Or, I think it's partly that they have this personality trait. I bet this is, I don't have data, right? But I bet this is correlated with what the psychologists call openness to experience, right? Which is one of the 5 major personality traits. So in the 5-factor model of personality. So I bet, people who are high in openness to experience, they're more likely to become philosophers or do other abstract intellectual pursuits. And this also includes like a comfort with novelty or a liking for novelty. And it just happens that the things that seem radically false, things that seem radically contrary to common sense, are also novel and therefore exciting and fun, right? There are also rewards in the sort of academic community for saying these things, right? Like you don't get famous for saying something obvious that everybody knows.
Yeah, right.
You're famous for saying something that's radically revisionary. So
okay, yeah, sure. That makes sense. So why phenomenal conservatism, the term? So phenomenon, basically from the first person perspective, things just appear the way they seem. So why conservatism, the term, to accept your appearances, I guess, pretty much.
Yeah. So just for the viewers, the English word phenomenon comes from the Greek word phenomena, which means appearances, even though that's not what it means in English. Okay. So it's a conservatism about appearances, meaning that we try to preserve the appearances. So just like keep your belief system as close to the appearances as possible, compatible with it being a coherent belief system. And so if the appearances conflict with each other, then you try to make kind of the least revision that you can to restore coherence.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess really I just wanted to talk about, I just wanted to clarify how phenomenal conservatism works. You have this self-defeating argument against skeptics of phenomenal conservatism. Is it basically a reductio ad absurdum argument? You basically say, well, if you deny PC, then that leads to either a contradiction, which is that you have to justify it based on PC, or that you just basically have no justification for skepticism. Like,
yeah,
is that correct?
Yeah, it's basically a reductio. Well, so my claim is I want the theorists to reflect on how they're arriving at their own beliefs. So there's somebody who has some other view about justification. It's not phenomenal conservatism. I want them to reflect on why they believe this other theory that they have, which, we assume is incompatible with PC. So they are denying that appearances are a source of justification. And then I claim you're just going to realize that your own view, you believe it ultimately because of the way things seem to you. Something seemed right to you, and then you build a theory based on that. Then, so when you realize that, and your theory says that things seeming right to you doesn't provide justification for them, so then that means that you should think that you're not justified in believing that theory. This is not an outright contradiction. So in the traditional reductio ad absurdum that you learn in logic class, you're supposed to get, P and not P. So this is not P and not P, but it's a more paradoxical situation.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. It's P, and I'm not justified in that belief.
Would skeptics accept that argument? Like, do they find that strong, or like skeptics of PC say, like, I don't know. Oh, well, I guess they would have some kind of clever argument against your denial of PC argument, but would like skeptics actually accept that, I guess?
Well, I mean, skeptics don't accept anything, so no, that doesn't matter what you say.
Okay.
So, my goal isn't really to convince actual skeptics, because, they might be unconvincible, because they might just be irrational. But, but mostly it's people who have rival theories of justification, and what they would most likely do is try to show how their rival theory explains how the belief in that theory is justified.
Okay, yeah.
So like the acquaintance theorist could say, oh, well, so my belief isn't justified because of the appearances. It's justified because of my acquaintance, which is similar. It's not totally different from appearances, but it's distinct because acquaintance is supposed to be it's a success term.
Yeah, right.
Or, the reliabilist would say, oh, well, I am justified because I formed this belief by a reliable method.
Right, yeah.
Okay, and then so my response to this would be basically to argue that that is not the actual basis for your belief. So make this sort of like, as a psychological point, the actual reason why you believe the thing is that it appears to you to be the case, not that the faculty is reliable or whatever it might be, like not that you're actually acquainted.
Okay, great. How does phenomenal conservatism differ from W.D. Ross's Prima Facie duties? I mean, you mentioned them, but then Ross says, well, I guess Ross just says it just appears to you to be true that you have these duties, like promises to keeping your promises to your friends, or preventing suffering. What's the difference, I guess?
I think Ross didn't say that much about the epistemology. But I don't remember this that well. I did read The Right and the Good, but it was a long time ago. But I don't think there was that much explicit discussion of why you're justified in believing these things.
Right.
Basically, I agree with Ross. I have basically the same ethical view. There's a collection of things that seem right in general, and and sometimes they conflict with each other, and then you have to sort of like intuitively weigh in your mind which thing seems like the more important duty in the circumstances. So all that, I agree with all that.
Okay, and so this. I mean, is there a duty to eliminate defeaters? So like, it's not just that you have appearances. Do you have to actively seek out evidence against defeat or evidence for defeaters, etc., or is it just like a passive thing?
Yeah, so you get justification for believing P if P seems true and you don't have any defeaters, and so that's it. Now, so if you don't have any defeaters, but you would have gotten one if you had looked for it, you still have justification for believing P. However, if you have reason to think that you would have gotten a defeater if you looked for it, that's a defeater already.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, also, the other thing to say is, well, you get some degree of justification, but the degree of justification that you need to count as being justified in outright believing something can vary with the context. And in some contexts, you might need a higher degree of justification than others. Okay, so if you're planning some momentous action on the basis of your belief about P, then you need a higher degree of justification than you would normally need for for less important actions or for a purely theoretical question that you're not going to base actions on. Okay, and so you can get in contexts where you need a high enough level of justification that you have to actively go out and look for defeaters, you have to look for extra evidence and so on, right?
Okay, yeah, makes sense. And in your writings, you don't prioritize any one seeming, I think. Could you clarify, like, why not? Like, why not accept introspection over perceptual seemings, I guess? But you seem to be pretty epistemically, you accept it all, I guess, whichever, well, I guess it depends on the context for you, etc.
Yeah. Yeah, there are multiple different kinds of appearances. There are sensory appearances, so, like the way things look, sound, etc. And then there are introspective appearances, which is where you seem to have a mental state, where, by the way, that might just be part of the mental state itself. If you have a conscious mental state, having the appearance of having that mental state is part of it. Okay. But, there are intuitions, which are when you think about something in a purely intellectual way and something just seems right to you intellectually, like it seems like 3 is larger than 2, just when you think about it. Okay. And there are memory appearances, like you seem to remember something. So those are all sources of justification. And other things being equal, like if they're equally strong and you have equally many defeaters or few defeaters, then you have no reason to privilege one of them over the others. And why do I say that? Because I just don't know why you would privilege one of them over the others. Which, by the way, like, it appears that there are sort of like major approaches to epistemology that rest on, I would say, arbitrarily privileging one kind of appearance over others. So if you're an empiricist, you privilege sensory appearances, but not intuitions. You start by accepting sensory appearances at face value, but you don't accept intuitions at face value as a source of justification. But if you're like a skeptic, the skeptics in epistemology, they will privilege introspection, most of them, right? Like external world skeptics will privilege introspection and reasoning and intuitions over sensory appearances. Right? So it's sort of the reverse of what the empiricists do. But these are both arbitrary. Like, I don't know why we would start by privileging one of these over others.
Okay, sure. Well, I guess, like, is your view, like, is your view a direct realist view? Like, or is it like a representational realist or non-direct or indirect realist view? What exactly are you claiming in that distinction, I guess?
Yeah, I have a direct realist view about perceptual knowledge. But, this might not be the same. It's not the same version of direct realism as some other people have that you might be expecting, right? Anyway, so because of phenomenal conservatism, you're justified in believing certain external world propositions. And this is foundational justification. So I'm justified in, let's say there's a hand here. I'm justified in believing there's a hand here. Now, maybe I should say something more limited, like there's a hand-shaped object with a certain color. There's an object with a certain color and shape. Maybe that's what I'm foundationally justified in believing. Okay, but I'm foundationally justified in believing that external world proposition, right? Not simply that I have an experience of a hand. And the reason I'm justified in believing the external world claim is that that's the content of the appearance. What appears to me to be the case is that there's a hand. What appears to me to be the case is not merely that I have a hand experience. It's not that I appear to have a hand experience. It's that there appears to be a hand. And so I'm allowed to start with that unless I have reason for doubting it. Okay, so that counts as epistemological direct realism, right? Meaning that some external world propositions are foundationally justified.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, is that like a big threat to you? Like, is the indirect realist a big threat to your view, or is it as big of a threat as skepticism, or like, are you like fighting both camps, I guess?
Yes, I mean, like how big of a threat, you could be referring to like how much they're different from my view, I guess, but also like how much I take their view seriously, I guess.
Yeah,
I take indirect realism more seriously than skepticism. Like it's a more reasonable view. So in that sense, it's a bigger threat. But it's also closer to my view because it's a form of realism. We both believe in the external world and that we could know stuff about it. Most philosophers who thought about the subject were indirect realists. So it's not an irrational position. And there are superficially strong seeming arguments for it, right? Which I talk about in Skepticism and the Veil of Perception.
Okay, yeah, so like, do you think that some people just have less reliable intuitions or seemings? Does that make sense?
Yes. I mean, yeah, so that's true of all kinds of seemings, right? Like some people have better memory than others. Like this is very well known. You can just like easily test that. Some people have better perception than others. Like there could be people who, I don't know, like you need glasses because your vision is not that good. There could be people who are colorblind. It would be shocking if that wasn't true of intuition. Right? It would be a total shock if people didn't differ in how good their intuition was, like given that we differ in every other ability. Yeah, and the people who have better intuitions, I mean, this is going to be strongly correlated with IQ, right? Like the smarter people they're going to have sort of more intuitions They're going to be able to intuit more things. Like sometimes, like when you read, I don't know, like if you're reading about some mathematical system, you read like one of the axioms, like it'll be something that the mathematicians think is self-evident, but like you have to spend 5 minutes figuring out what it's even saying.
Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, but like the smart people could have the intuition, right? Like, I don't know, like you're reading the axiom of foundation or something in set theory, and it's not that hard to understand, but okay. And,
right,
there could be somebody who just can't intuit that, but like the people who do intuit it, like they shouldn't therefore conclude that they don't know it.
Right. And so you accept that sometimes, are there like people who are too dumb to perceive the truth or, whatever the seemings or intuitions then? Too low IQ, I guess, on your view.
Yeah, I mean, that's one possibility. And, the other thing is like there could be people who just have a deficit in one specific area.
Right,
okay,
true.
So like there's color blindness where you can't see colors, but you can make out the different shapes of things. Okay, so, there might be moral blindness, which might be the case of psychopathy. Okay, so like these people are just not understanding. They're not having ethical intuitions, but it appears that they're not even understanding ethics as such. They just don't even understand what we're talking about when we say stuff is right or wrong. That appears to be what's going on.
Okay. And how would phenomenal conservatism apply to like Ryle's difference between knowing how and knowing that propositions, right? Like in logic class, you're taught that propositions are about knowing that propositions, not knowing how. But then Ryle says, well, knowing how is a form of knowledge. But then it doesn't seem like phenomenal conservatism would apply here. Unless you accept or deny his arguments, I guess.
Yeah. Well, so the question that I was addressing had to do with knowing that or believing that, right?
Right.
So because this is what contemporary analytic epistemologists are mostly talking about, like whether you're justified in believing a proposition. And now you could ask if there's something analogous that applies to knowing how. So when you know that P, you have to be justified in believing P, and then we can talk about why you're justified because you have the appearance of P or something. If you know how to do something, like how to ride a bicycle, is there some question about justification there? I'm not sure. Maybe there's some kind of like practical justification, like you have practical justification for doing it in the way that you feel like doing it or something. Maybe like when you're riding the bicycle and your body is moving a certain way to ride it, maybe you're justified in moving in that way because that feels right or something. Maybe there's something like that.
Okay. So getting to the more of I'm interested in how phenomenal conservatism really applies to the real world. So why is it that people know what is right to do? Like saving a drowning child from a shallow pool, right? Why do people know what is right to do but don't do it? Or maybe like in the case of property damage and fleeing, right? So like why do people perceive the truth? Like they know, they can see it intellectually, but then they don't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, because people have many conflicting motives, and that being moral is not their only motive. In fact, it's not even a really strong one. So, and, if you want to ask, well, why is it that people have these other motives and their moral motivation isn't that strong? Evolutionary psychology, right? It is, we evolved to have all these emotions and desires that would have promoted reproductive fitness in our evolutionary past. And so, like the people who were not selfish did not succeed as much in our evolutionary history as the ones who were selfish. And that's why we've got these sort of like instincts of selfishness, right? So you're like, yeah, the case of the drowning child, almost everyone would save the child. Okay. But that's because they would have an emotional reaction. But when you hear that there are people starving, usually it's more like malnutrition and diseases that we could prevent or could cure if they just had more money. Okay, so you hear about that and you don't have the same emotional reaction. Well, because you're not seeing them. And in our evolutionary history, you just didn't have this situation where you were hearing in the abstract that something was happening, but you weren't seeing it. Like you didn't evolve to form social emotions about people who are not part of your group and that you've never met. So you don't have the emotional reaction, and then you don't care, but you do care about keeping your money because you like having money for obvious reasons. So then like a lot of people just don't give. They just don't help the people in the rest of the world.
Yeah, but like what if people like laugh or like, smile when like a child is drowning? Like how do you explain that? Because it seems like they think it's good. Does that even make sense? Like they think it's like funny, or like we don't think it's funny. Like no, that's horrible. But then to them it's like,
wait, are there people who are laughing at drowning children?
There might be. Well, aren't there like...
I'm laughing at the idea of laughing at.
No. I'm pretty sure there's like they've caught some people who laugh at like drowning people, people who are drowning.
So I don't know. I mean, like, I don't know if these are psychopaths or these are just like immature children or something like that. Because why are there psychopaths? Well, yeah, that's probably an evolutionary adaptation. How adaptive it is to be a psychopath depends upon sort of the frequency in the population. So if most of the rest of your society is normal people, then there is room for somebody to succeed by preying on the normal people. And that's why there are psychopaths. Right? Probably evolution, in fact, selected for a certain number of people to do that. But if too many people are doing that, it breaks down. If everybody's acting like a psychopath, then nothing's being produced. There's nothing for you to prey on. Actually, long before that point, the normal people start to get much more suspicious, and then they start doing more stuff to stop the psychopaths. Okay, and then it becomes less profitable. So there's like an equilibrium where there's sort of just right. Okay, so that's probably why those people exist, and they just don't feel empathy. They're just like congenitally incapable of feeling empathy.
Didn't you argue in revisionary intuitionism against personal biases and evolutionary explanations, or was I misreading you? I guess I'm just wondering why you're appealing to evolution when I thought I read somewhere that you were against evolution explanations, I guess, or was I wrong?
Well, evolutionary explanations of what is the question, right?
Okay.
So I think that it's plausible that there is an evolutionary explanation of psychopathy. So a lot of the stuff that people are doing where it looks like they're serving their own interests at the expense of others, I think there's an evolutionary explanation of that. But then the other stuff where it looks like people are helping others at the expense of themselves, I think is not really, that's not explained by evolution. That's just explained by goodness.
Okay.
Like you saw that was a good thing to do.
Right. Yeah. Are you familiar with Jonathan Haidt's work on liberals and conservatives? It seems like he's deploying intuitions too. Is his use of intuitions the same as yours? Although I feel like he mixes intuitions with desires. I guess he thinks that desires are moral desires are like a species of moral, I don't know the word, moral decision making, I guess. But then, or moral intuitions. And so he says that he says that conservatives have more moral taste than more moral taste receptors than liberals, etc. And so is that a case of your usage of intuitions, or is it different?
Well, so in psychology, I think people are maybe less fussy or less specific about the term intuition than philosophers, right? So for me, intuition it's a fairly specific thing, right? It's an initial intellectual appearance. I don't think that the psychologists I don't think they care that much about whether the thing they're talking about is really an intuition. What they're really talking about is I asked some people some question and I got their off-the-cuff response. I asked people, hey, what do you think about this? The brother-sister incest case. And, that Haidt discusses where, they use two forms of birth control. So don't worry, there's not going to be a pregnancy, whatever. So you can't say it's going to cause birth defects. And it was totally consensual and they both had a good time and it didn't ruin their relationship. And was it okay? And then, what do you think about that? And then just whatever people say, they call that an intuition, right? So they don't I don't think that they do anything to ensure that the people didn't actually reason to that conclusion, right? Oh, that actually no, I guess I should revise this. It looks they tries to argue that they didn't reason to it because he argues with them, he stipulates things about the case that are supposed to prevent you from using the reasons that people would usually use. Okay. Right. But anyway, the other thing is Haidt refers to his view as social intuitionism, and I refer to my view as ethical intuitionism. But intuitionism doesn't exactly mean the same thing, right? Because he's just trying to explain psychology. He's trying to explain people's actual beliefs. And I'm saying something about justification.
Right.
So he's saying people actually form their beliefs based upon intuitions, and I'm saying people should form their beliefs, or the correct way of justifying beliefs or something like that relies on intuitions. So these are connected, but they're not the same thesis, right? The psychologist wouldn't really be interested in arguing about justification, I don't think.
Okay, yeah. So what about the idea of just people having different intuitions that are not necessarily falsifying each other, I guess? So it's not that it's not like I see my hand, or it's not like it appears to me that there's a hand, and then some skeptic says, well, no, that's not true. There's no hand. It's more like, yeah, I'm a liberal. This seems correct, and I'm a conservative. This seems correct. Or I'm a libertarian, and this seems correct, right? So like, is there a case for just different intuitions, or is that like just not just nonsensical? I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, okay. So you can have different intuitions that don't conflict with each other. You might think, well, that's not really a problem. So what? But also, there's like, because I take this to be connected to the question about Jonathan Haidt's work, where Haidt thought that I think there are 5 moral foundations. Is that right?
6.
Oh, okay, 6. Okay. So, and I don't remember what they all are, but one of them has to do with harm and care, like harm is bad, care is good.
Sanctity and degradation and liberty and oppression.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I think he added that one right now. So there used to be fewer. And then like some libertarians said that you have to add in liberty versus oppression. So, okay. Now, I don't know, you could probably expand this more. But anyway, the thing is, like, all of these things that he talks about, they're things that a normal person can feel. Right? Like, it's not like, if you interview Democrats, they're going to say, no, loyalty is not good. What are you talking about? They're going to appreciate the value of loyalty, because that's one of the things where conservatives are higher than liberals. They have a higher emphasis on loyalty, higher emphasis on purity and sanctity. Okay, but it's not that a large portion of the population won't see these things at all. It's just that they will emphasize them to different degrees. So the conservatives will put more emphasis on loyalty and sanctity and whatever patriotism, things related to that, than the liberals. Okay, so it's, in a way, like, it seems like it's not an outright contradiction. It's not like we're rejecting your values. It's just that we have different emphasis. But then that can lead to conflicting judgments about, particular policy issues.
Sure, yeah. He also says that libertarians are more they respond with, or they're more likely to feel psychological reactance, which is a response to authority. So like, if people tell you to, like, people telling you to, like, people commanding you to do things leads to like this feeling of like, hey, no, I'm not gonna do what you say. Do you think libertarians suffer from psychological reactance, and like that like affects their decision making too, or is that false, or what do you think?
I mean, I bet that's true. Yeah. I haven't seen the data on that, but I bet that's true, because libertarians are constantly going around, myself included, like, talking about how there's no legitimate authority or whatever.
Yeah, right.
Just being suspicious of authority figures, and just like, when you see the authority figure, you're just like always thinking they're probably abusing their authority. I don't know.
Right.
Okay. But, is this a bias on our part, or is this just like we're seeing things correctly and everybody else is biased? Everybody else has a pro-authority bias, right? And, I do have an evolutionary explanation for why there would be this pro-authority bias, right? It's because in our evolutionary past, if you didn't have the pro-authority bias, then the authority figures would do nasty things to you. So, like if you like, unreasonably take the perspective of the authority figure, you're supporting them, like, you're great, we want to do what you want, then you succeeded better, right? Because they would give you favors, or at least refrain from oppressing you.
Okay, yeah, sure. So following a similar line of thinking, do you think men and women have different intuitions? There's like the Kohlberg models of like, men are more interested in justice and abstract universals, or universal principles, but then the feminists who can be against the Kohlberg models will say things like women are more interested in care when it comes to ethics, right? So like, is there any validity there, you think?
I mean, I bet that's true too. So like, again, like, I'm not an expert on the science, but yeah, that totally seems plausible, right? There's going to be some difference in intuitions. And again, it's not going to be that like one sex just rejects values accepted by the other. It's just going to be that there's a difference in emphasis. So like, men and women can both see the value of justice, and we can both see the value of caring. It's just that the women are more likely to emphasize the value of caring more, right? And there are probably evolutionary explanations for that, because, in our evolutionary past, women were mostly caring for children who are very vulnerable and need a lot of care, and they don't need a lot of justice. And, in the past, men were spending more of their time interacting with other men, and justice was more important and caring was less important.
Okay. So next question. So like, I guess I'm thinking about like, when I was reading Phenomenal Conservatism, or your articles on Phenomenal Conservatism, I was thinking about Orwell's Doublethink, of like the situation where Winston is told, or Winston believes, or Winston is told that 2 plus 2 is 5, even though he knows 2 plus 2 is.
Yeah.
And I guess I was wondering if like you think people suffer from the same experience, I guess, where like people know not to eat meat, I guess, or something, but then they're told it's okay, or like some other scenario. What do you think about that?
I mean, it's not so much what people are told as what you see other people doing. So like when you give people the argument for vegetarianism, it's fairly easy. Well, if you have somebody who's kind of like open-minded and intellectual, it's pretty easy to convince them that buying animal products in our current society is wrong in almost all cases, right? Pretty easy to make that argument. Sometimes like you have to spend a few rounds going through ridiculous objections, like, how do we know animals are really conscious? And animals eat other animals. Why can't we eat them? But, after you refute a few of these ridiculous things, then like really a large number of people will go, yeah, it's wrong. But, I'm going to keep doing it. But the reason that they're going to keep doing it is that they will say they're too weak-willed and, they're just enjoying the taste of meat. They're too weak to implement their moral values. But that's not really the reason. The real reason is that eating meat is socially accepted, and being vegetarian is weird in our society, and people's instinct of social conformity is stronger than their moral commitment. That's what's really happening.
Okay. And to be more precise, do you believe in evil, moral evil? I mean, I guess you talk about like you talk a lot about goodness, but then like I guess the opposite spectrum or side. Do you believe there's like clear morally evil things or whatever, or is it just yeah?
I mean, well, there are evil people, right? I mean, there's not like an entity, there's not like Satan or whatever in the world. There's not like an entity that's bringing about the evil, but like there are some bad people in the world, right? So there are people who want to cause harm. You want me to prove this? Like, look at the serial killers in history, like that's an easy one. There's like, Ted Bundy, who was just like, he murdered something like 30 women during the 1970s for fun. It's just like completely straight up, like that's like no other reason. He just thought it would be fun, Or, like we have people who are just like people in the Middle East blowing stuff up, just like blowing up innocent people, and they think that they're going to go to heaven for that. They would describe themselves as good because they're claiming that God wants them to do that. But I think that if you think that God wants you to commit heinous murders and like, you think that God wants you to burn babies, right? This is like to take a really clear example because that's a thing that has happened, then you're evil, right? Because like a good person would not think that God wanted that.
Yeah, like why is there so much, like, are people just confused? Like, why is there so much moral? I mean, there's a lot of differing opinions, but like, why do people not agree with what's morally right, I guess, or what's good? Like you say, I mean, people just think like the most heinous crimes are good for some reason. Like, why is there so much diversity, moral diversity? I don't know, like opinions on morality. What's your take?
Well, I guess the first thing is that people start out being, radically wrong about everything. Okay, so if you go back like to the beginning of civilization, then you look at the beliefs that people had about the world. Okay, so like their beliefs about their immediate physical environment would generally be correct. Like there would be a tree where they thought there was a tree because they could see it. But their theoretical beliefs would be just completely 100% wrong. Like they think the earth is made of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. No, none of those is an element. And, okay, there are elements, but none of those is one. And then, they think that diseases are caused by imbalances of the 4 bodily humors. Nope, no disease is caused by that. So just 100% wrong. And, and also in ethics, their beliefs start out just completely wrong. Okay, but in ethics, it's a little bit more complicated because there's more motivated reasoning. So there's more stuff that people would want to believe, more like motivation for believing something that isn't true about ethics, because you like to believe that you're doing the right thing, but you also don't necessarily want to do the right thing. You want to do the thing that serves yourself, but then you want to believe that you're doing the right thing. So then you want to distort your moral beliefs so that you can believe the thing that serves yourself is the right thing. So there's that. And then, they're influenced by just the traditions of their society. So there's a lot of stuff like leading people wrong.
Yeah, it seems like you spend a lot of time fighting Hume and like passions and desires. Can you like go like be more thorough? Like are you against the Humean version of like passion and ethics and morality, or like what's going on there?
Oh yeah. So the Humean view is actions can only be motivated by desires, and these desires are largely emotional. I don't know if they're all emotional or anyway, but like in the Humean view, this isn't exactly Hume's view, but this is the Humean view in modern times. The only reason for doing anything is that it will help to satisfy some desire. Okay. And I think we need to distinguish desires from values. So sometimes you have a judgment, and there's a genuine judgment, not a desire, that something ought to be done or that something is good. And that might conflict with your desires. And I think it is possible to do the thing, and you have reason to do the thing that you think is good or right. You might have more reason to do that than to do the thing that you want to do that satisfies your desires. Right. So, Hume was wrong about that. And, like I have further arguments about this, like I can give you examples where that seems to be the case. Okay. If you take the Humean view strictly, just as an aside, I think Hume's actual view is that there's no such thing as a reason for action. Right? I think, his actual view is actions cannot be reasonable or unreasonable. There's no such thing as irrational action. Okay, but the modern people who call themselves Humeans don't want to say that because that's too extreme and kind of crazy. So they want to say there are rational and irrational actions, but the rational actions are the ones that appear to satisfy your desires based upon your beliefs about how the world works or something like that. Maybe they maximize desire satisfaction. Okay, so anyway, so if that's your view, you want some actions to be rational and some to be irrational, then I have cases for you where, it looks like the Humean view isn't going to work out, okay? So like, I think the Humeans are pushed towards the view that the rational thing is just always to do whatever you most want to do right now. And that will also be what you actually do. Okay, because the only factor that contributes to reasons for action is the same as the thing that contributes to motivation for action, which is desire. So there could be no explanation of why you would voluntarily do the thing that isn't rational, right? The rational thing is the thing that's most supported by your strongest desires or whatever. And that's also the thing you have most motivation to do. So there's no explanation for why you wouldn't do the rational thing. Okay, so like you might think, you have a test tomorrow and you're supposed to study for the test, but you would also like to party. Okay, so like, if you're like some undergraduate students, you party all night and then the next day of the test, you regret that you didn't study for it. Okay, but it looks like there's a Humean argument that no, that was totally rational. Because at the time that you were partying, that's what you wanted to do more. You wanted the pleasure of partying more than you wanted to get a good grade on the test the next day. Of course, the next day your desire changed, but that's irrelevant because at the time you made the decision, you had a stronger desire to party. Yeah. And that's proved by the fact that that's what you did. Okay, so it wasn't irrational. Right? You see what I mean? So then it's just going to be, they're not going to be able to explain how any action gets judged to be irrational.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm interested in applying phenomenal conservatism to legal epistemology, especially police epistemology. I guess it kind of makes sense to me. They say things like police officers must have reasonable suspicion or probable cause. And that seems to me just them saying in Terry v. Ohio, a reasonable officer must, I guess if it must seem to a reasonable officer that criminal activity is afoot, it basically just seems like they're saying the standard is phenomenal conservatism. Is that correct, you think? Or is that like too much or not correct?
So I don't know the legal precedent that much. So, okay, but I would assume just based upon, I don't know, my familiarity with legal cases more generally, that you wouldn't be able to appeal to idiosyncratic appearances.
Right.
So if it turns out that, well, it just seemed to you like this person was committing a crime, but in a way that it wouldn't have seemed to any normal person looking at the case, then the judge is going to say, okay, that was an illegal search or whatever it was. So, okay. But what is the basis for a reasonable suspicion? Yeah, that's going to be appearances, just like the basis for everything is for, anything being reasonable is the appearances. So I'm going to say that that's also the basis for the police making judgments. But they have this special context in which they're required to try to conform their judgments to what they think other people would make in order to be legal. And that's partly because, well, you want the law to be predictable. But you don't want it to be that if you run into a weird cop who has like weird reactions, then you get arrested or something when you wouldn't have by a normal cop, right?
Yeah, I guess they would say like, you have to articulate your reasons, so like it's not arbitrary that you decided to stop somebody. And plus, like, reasonable suspicion is more like, well, it's more like suspicion, right? So like, I don't really know, but it seems like something might be going on. And then probable cause is more like, yeah, I'm pretty sure you did this crime.
Yeah.
But yeah, but
yeah.
like,
Yeah, the other thing, actually, sorry, just to interrupt a little bit. The other thing is, like, we're worried when you're making legal rules, you're worried about people abusing the system. And when we're doing epistemology, we're not worried about that. Okay. So if you could just say, well, I had an intuition, then people would totally abuse that. They would just say they had intuitions all the time. Whenever the cop felt like stopping someone, they would just say, yeah, it just seemed to me. And they would just lie about it. So that's why you need to have something that's like publicly observable, as the basis for your.
Yeah, like if it is true that phenomenal conservatism applies to police epistemology, does that like justify the current legal standards as strong, or is that like epistemically fragile? Like, is it like I'm not sure if like that's good or bad. What do you think?
Well, I mean, as far as I understand it, the current standards in the U.S. are pretty reasonable. I mean, just like about when you're allowed to search or when you're allowed to arrest somebody, you have to have probable cause or something like that. It seems pretty reasonable. But by the way, I think I would say, like, I don't think that it's specific to phenomenal conservatism. Like anybody who had a theory about why ordinary beliefs about the external world are justified, they would have a story about why the cop might be justified in thinking that some criminal activity was afoot, right? So, I mean, because phenomenal conservatism is in fact the correct view, it's the actually correct basis. But if you think that some other view is correct, then you would also say that view was the basis for reasonable suspicion or whatever.
Okay, right. Yeah, makes sense. So last question. So like animal minds, so like am I justified based on phenomenal conservatism to infer or believe that my dog has a mind, specifically in terms of intentions? Like it seems like my dog intends to go outside or like,
yes,
do something. And so, it's a pretty strong appearance. Should I believe that? Like, is that justified, or are there like, is that prima facie justified, or what's going on there?
Yes. Yeah. Like.
So dogs have other minds?
Yeah. Like you take the leash and then the dog starts getting excited, starts wagging his tail. So he looks excited and then he goes over to the door, so that would be easy to go out. It really sure looks like he's trying to go for a walk. Right. I don't see any particular reason for doubting that. Right. So it's, the dog is probably doing what it looks like he's doing, unless you have a reason to think otherwise, and I don't see the reason to think otherwise.
Okay. Yeah, and just to clarify, is that like a non-propositional? Well, like they don't have language, verbal English language or whatever, and so like I guess are we justified in believing that they do have a mind if like they don't even have the words to tell us, or like
well,
how does language work there? I guess.
Yeah, you have a lot of thoughts and feelings that you can't put into words, right? Or you can't exactly describe, right? Okay. And, like babies who can't talk, they still have feelings and whatever. Okay. And, so the other animals are having thoughts and feelings. Now, you could wonder whether the way that you would be tempted to describe the dog's intentions is accurate. Like, the dog, okay, he saw me take the leash and now he thinks we're going for a walk because I'm carrying the leash. Like, is that exactly what he's thinking in those concepts? Maybe that's not exactly it, right? But that's roughly what's going through his mind, right? So he couldn't say that because he doesn't have all those words. And he may not know what a leash is. It's like, he may not think of it, that is, may not have the concept that we have, but he does recognize that object, right? Yeah. So, like the way that you would describe it in English is probably like a reasonable approximation to describing the dog's state of mind.
Okay. Well, yeah. Final question. So like, how does this apply to AI? So like if AI is getting so advanced that like what if they created an AI that just appears to have a mind, right? Like it appears, well, like because right now like ChatGPT is, I don't sense anything from ChatGPT. It just doesn't seem like it's alive or conscious. But what if someday that happens? Are we justified in believing that it's conscious?
Yeah, good. And by the way, like, how it appears to you might depend upon what you know beforehand. So if you're chatting with somebody online and nobody tells you that it's a computer, then it might be like who's having experiences. Well, in fact, I don't think any of these things is close to having a mind at all. Any mental states whatsoever. Okay, but basically, I think the reason I think this is that attributing mental states to it would play no role in explaining what it's doing. So, like, all the evidence you have is the text that the chatbot is giving you, and my claim is you already know independently that the explanation for that text coming out is a machine implementing an algorithm, and you don't have to use any mental states, right? It was like, if it didn't have mental states, it would still be producing that output because that's the output of the algorithm. It's just doing a really huge calculation to arrive at this sequence of characters, okay? So since you already have an independent explanation for this stuff that's coming out that doesn't involve mental states, there's no reason to attribute mental states to it. Now, that's not the case for people. Like, you don't have independent knowledge that there's some algorithm that doesn't involve mental states that's explaining the words coming out of my mouth, right? And and by the way, the algorithm that the computer is implementing, it's super improbable for there to be an object implementing that algorithm, but we have an explanation. Or it's super improbable if you didn't have an explanation, but we do have an explanation, which is that some beings who are conscious deliberately programmed it to use that algorithm deliberately for the purpose of simulating having mental states. Like, that's why it's making outputs that make it look like it has mental states, because somebody deliberately tried to make it look that way.
Yeah, right. So, like, how does that differ from, like, people pointing to neuroscience in people? Like, hey, you think you have free will, or you think you have this and that, but then underneath the hood, it's just the brain and like neurons firing and see neurons firing or whatever.
Yeah. Well, this is what the physicalists say. Like, the physicalists would say, human behavior is all just the product of physical mechanisms, just like the computer. Like, there's an algorithm being implemented by your brain that doesn't involve any mental states. And then my response would be, well, you don't know that. You're just saying that, right? Like, that's your view, like your philosophical whatever assumption, that we don't know that that's the case in the way that we know that the computer is implementing an algorithm, because you can talk to the people who program that algorithm, right? But you don't actually know that human beings are implementing an algorithm that doesn't involve mental states. And what you know about yourself is that you are having mental states, and it appears that these mental states are influencing your behavior. So it's reasonable that that's happening in other people.
Okay. Yeah. That's it for the interview. Do you have anything to say, Professor?
I don't know. Just, go look at my blog, Fake News, and go buy my books on Amazon.
All right. Thank you.